Thank you very, very much, Mr. Austin. President Lee, distinguished guests, and the South African who was introduced earlier, and those who have not yet been introduced, I bid you good day. I thought that I was coming to be among polite society and had not expected to laugh at some of the risque jokes. So I thought, well, if this crowd has an appetite for smiling at some issues that could be a bit salty, I would start my talk because I've grappled with what to touch on. I was asked by my very good friend Peter Cullen whether I would come and speak to Rotary about the South Africa-New Zealand relationship. And as you know, it is so multi-layered. It's really a case of what to leave out rather than what to include. That is the issue. So I thought I would touch on maybe some issues you might not be aware of, touch on some familiar ground, rugby, did I hear anyone say? And also perhaps end on where South Africa would like to take the relationship. But I think having grappled with, as I've said, exactly the tone and pitch, I thought maybe let me start by making a statement that was once said to me by a colleague I worked with in my very, very early days of my working career when all my hair was still black and I did not have the sprinkling of pepper that I have now. I was complaining about one or other thing, and this gentleman's name was James Corson. So you can tell that that doesn't sound African. So he looked like the majority of people in this room here. So he looked at me and said, "Oh, Zodwa, don't you know that life is like a black woman's left breast?" And I raised myself up to my full height. I was slimmer then, so I looked even taller, so I could take proper offense at this. And he said, "It's not right and it's not fair." So in times of trial and a bit of tribulation, I always think of my good friend James, and I'm like, well, what can I say? Anyway, where does the New Zealand-South Africa relationship come from? Well, firstly, both countries are members of the Commonwealth, having both been members of the British Empire, having been colonized by Britain. And there is a commonality that I had not realized about this legacy until I went to Hamilton and had the opportunity to listen to a leading Maori scholar who might be known by you, Mr. Ranganui Walker, professor or doctor, I'm not sure about his designation. And looking at New Zealand's history, we realized that we shared one particular governor called Sir George Grey, who spent time toggling, quite literally, between New Zealand and South Africa. And with hindsight, it's quite clear what lessons he brought with him from one country to another on his merry way. And the issue with South Africa and colonialism is that it is a past that, of course, has left a legacy that we're not quite comfortable with in some respects. But what it has also bequeathed us is something that we've come to appreciate over time. And again, it comes back to the South African spirit and wanting to be activist and always having strong feelings and opinions to be expressed. I had a chat to a Ghanaian journalist while I was in Accra at my posting. And we were talking, and I was talking about all the things I admired about Accra and Ghana, the Black Star, the first one to be free. And I said to South Africa, yeah, we are very happy, you know, we are in our post-apartheid period. And you know, my cup was half full as I expressed it to him. And he looked at me and said, "Can I tell you something?" So I said, "For sure." And he said, I was in Durban for a conference, and I had reason to chat to a number of South Africans. And one of your lot was talking again about a cup being half empty. And I looked at him and I said, well, if you'd rather have as much time as we've had of freedom and liberation, I'd be more than happy to bring a bulldozer and lift all of Durban's waterfront and go and plonk it on Accra's waterfront. So if that is the legacy of colonialism and apartheid that makes you so unhappy, that is fine, but we're here now. And I'm saying what you need to recognize is what else it has delivered. And it's one of those awakenings that take a while. We hosted the World Conference Against Racism and all forms of discrimination, I think back in 2000, it was before the World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002, but in the early 2000s, a very, very big UN conference. And it was the first opportunity that South Africans across the spectrum had the opportunity to receive members of the human family from across the globe who had brought with them their baggage and packages of neglect, of discrimination, of racism, of class distinction. And it is something that South Africa, more than 20 years later, is still, or rather, yeah, more than 20 years, is still, taking a deep breath to think about. Because when you look at your situation and you experience it, that's your world, that's what you know. And it's almost like your badge of honor. I cannot be a black South African if the effects, the deleterious effects of being discriminated against in the society I grew up in is not part of my deal. But when you speak to members of the Dalit community in India who say that merely by being born into this caste, I and all those who came before me and all those who will come after me have been consigned to this part of society. That was a wake-up call. Because the issue with South Africa is, while I would not whitewash or paint in very broad strokes about where we come from, but the distinguishing feature of where we are and how far we've come from is that the possibility of moving onwards and upwards has been created, which is why I'm able to stand here before you today and engage with you. And if I may segue into, again, a connection with New Zealand, and again taking it from Sir George Grey and what he did to Maori and what he did to Africans. There is a very curious historical fact that, I don't know, we think that maybe somebody from the archives somewhere in London needs to remember it and lift the classification of it. And it's called the Great Cattle Killing of the Klose. Now, the Klose, you might or might not know, are from the eastern side of South Africa. And that is where the British settlers arrived in 1820. And there were frontier wars and all sorts of engagement. And part of the background of South Africa's indigenous people, which is similar to the indigenous people of New Zealand, is a belief in the unseen, is a belief in the spiritual world, is a belief in your ancestors. And as part of the wars that were happening over a very long time, Sir George Grey, although it has yet to be proven, found a way to break the back of these resistant people. And that was by convincing a young girl called Nongqawuse. Now that might be a bit hard for your tongue, so let me say it. Nongqawuse, who was an initiate in traditional healing, who is said to have called on the chiefs and other respected people of her area to say she's had a vision and she's been visited by her ancestors who have told her that, on this particular day, all the troubles of the Xhosa will be over. These pesky white people with their yellow hair that looks like, what do you call the hair on sheaves of corn in English? What's the word for it? Silk. Yes, in Xhosa it's called ubulembu. These pale people with, hair like ubulembu will be driven into the sea, and the sun will shine from the west. It will rise from the west and set in the east. And all sorts of wonderful things would happen. But for this to happen, they had to kill all their cattle. Now, wealth then was measured by the number of cattle you had. Kill all these cattle and take your stores of grain and maize and wheat and everything, empty them, because your ancestors who've gone before you will rise up and they will come, the ones who had died a long time ago, and you guys who are fighting with these people who are coming in and taking your lands, and you will drive them into the sea. And there was toing and froing, but the large majority did. And of course, the sun would never ever rise from the west. And all sorts of things wouldn't happen. People would not rise from the dead, and also people will not be driven to the sea. But the way the story is told in South Africa depends on where you stand. But having interacted with a number of students of history, the belief is that Sir George Grey, being the very smart man that he was, thought there are very many ways of skinning a cat. And one of them is to get on with the business, is to tap into a belief system that doesn't quite accord with science and mathematics. And here we are today. I just thought I would share that with you. But fast forward to present day New Zealand and South Africa. The relationship between our two countries is so special and so solid, because on the platform of having played rugby for more than a century, and again off the platform of having had rugby become such a polarizing thing in your society as a result of deeply held views among New Zealanders. And this is a discovery I make every day, because the one that's in the briefing documents is the very big one that everybody knows of, which is the 1981 Springbok tour. But in speaking to people who have longer memories than 1981, there have been protests against South Africa's discriminatory practices that affected Maori players, which went way further than that, back decades. And I do want to say that long history of New Zealanders having concerned themselves with South Africa puts New Zealand in a more special position than many countries, because you've walked with us, and some of you have bought into our cause long before it was fashionable. Long before it was fashionable. You are in a position to hold up a mirror to us when things are not going as they should, as some people do. Say, I did not spend my youth protesting and getting beaten up so that you could turn out the way you have. And I think that is something that not many New Zealanders are aware of, that your ticket to the top table of engaging South Africa robustly was prepaid. It's prepaid a long time ago. And as with any country that is developing, as with any country that's trying to make the best way it can in the 21st century, there's stuff we get right, politically, socially, economically, and there's stuff we don't get right. And there are people who've never bothered with us, or people who came along after Mandela was free and it was okay to be concerned about South Africa. And that's okay, there's nothing wrong with that. All friends are friends. However, those friends who have walked with us the longest, and New Zealanders are counted among those, are those whose ear South Africa has, and those whose advice South Africa will heed. My 15 minutes is nearly up. So I'm trying to think, what else do I want to say? I also want to say that when our beloved Madiba passed away last year, I have never felt the outpouring of love and support that I did. I have colleagues who are in countries that are much bigger than New Zealand, but the memorial services that they held were so anemic compared to the memorial services that were held in New Zealand. And to those in the room who were with us, whether in person or in spirit, I want to say that South Africa thanks you. We thank you for the befitting manner in which as a country you stood still and you helped us to farewell one of our most beloved founding fathers. Having said all of that, where are we going? Firstly, I hope the Springboks are going to win come the 14th of September. I have my ticket from the New Zealand Rugby Union, and unlike the experience last year in Auckland, I look forward to swinging my South African scarf wildly as I leave the Westpac Stadium with a very decent margin over the All Blacks. And on a very serious note, even more serious than the rugby that we enjoy playing, New Zealand might be small in terms of numbers. However, New Zealand is big when it comes to what counts in the world. We are not here to ask for brown envelopes. We don't ask for charity. And what I say to my friends when I'm being rather immodest is that these hands, which might not be perfectly manicured, but look fairly decent, were not designed to hold out a begging bowl. What we do want from New Zealand, however, is investment. What we do want from New Zealand is partnerships. And we believe that if we can spend a lot of our time, we can find ways in which we can leverage the relationship that we have and the background we come from in order to deliver the benefits of freedom to South Africa, which would be about economic opportunity. And we can assure you, we have not joined the BRICS countries out of charity either. They saw the value of having South Africa on board. We do have business between the two countries, but as Minister Makali told my minister last April when they met, we can do better than this. Because the bilateral trade at the time was 212 New Zealand dollars, which really is nothing. It's very, very small. Fonterra is based in South Africa for the work that it does across the continent, and we are looking for more companies to do that because we are a gateway both to our region and to the continent. And I was reading over the weekend that a big South African company has bought into Postie, the retail chain that was on the market, having been in trouble. So in addition to speaking and engaging with groups like yours, I really do want to say my parting message to New Zealand is that let us take our friendship to another level. South Africa is open for business. Thank you. The 1995 Rugby World Cup win was huge. It was humongous for South Africa. It was actually the first opportunity after the very significant and emotional opportunity to vote for the first time for some of us in '94 and to watch President Mandela being inaugurated in May of that year. It was the first opportunity for a divided people to rally around something that we had actually as black people used against the minority oppressive regime at the time. So to have Mandela go onto that field in that jersey is something that is written in the history of South Africa because overnight it changed everything. I'll give you an example. Prior to '94, if you had South Africa, the Springboks playing against the All Blacks in particular, other teams matter, but the All Blacks are different. The All Blacks are the All Blacks. South Africans who love rugby, especially South Africans who are not white. That would be Africans, coloureds, and Indians. And I come from the Eastern Cape. So in addition to soccer, we play and enjoy rugby and cricket. Would always support any team except the Springboks. Would always support the All Blacks in particular. And one of our ministers, who had been in government until the most recent election now in May, Trevor Manuel, forgot that things had changed. And I'm not quite sure which match it was, but one of the first tournaments played in South Africa by the All Blacks against the Springboks, he did what he used to do in his struggle days. He went to the field in his All Blacks jersey. Well, did he get it in the neck from commentators. You are a minister of the Republic. How dare you? And he just turned around, shrugged his shoulders and said, old habits die hard. No, but having said that, the win in 1995 was very significant because a lot of black South Africans not really interested in rugby. It was something that you rallied around as you wanted a sports boycott in order to get to liberation. It's something that, you know, these white people in shorts come winter or summer, rain or shine, run around chasing this strange ball, you know. But that World Cup and Madiba and Francois Pinard and that jersey, people were embracing and kissing in the streets. It was a huge, huge turning point.